Hey everybody, Johnny the Queer POTUS here, and today I wanted to go through Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. It's definitely a speech that a lot of us know, but not all of us know the context in which this speech was given. Why was there a march on Washington? Why did Dr. Martin Luther King say the things he said? Why do we remember them in our history so well? What was going on in the country at the time that Martin Luther King gave this famous speech? And what did some of his critics have to say about his approach to civil rights? So we're going to begin today with the March on Washington, where Dr. King gave the speech. The official title of the march was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. It took place on August 28, 1963, on a Wednesday afternoon. King had worked on the speech the night before and worked through the night to complete it at the Willard Hotel not far from the mall. Dr. King was given 8 minutes to speak, but his speech went on for 17 minutes. He was unofficially the keynote speaker of the event, and he was the last person to speak. Who is his audience? Well, there are 250,000 people in attendance live listening to the speech over a PA system, and there are millions of people at home watching on TV. That's because the speech was broadcast on all 3 major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. The federal government has brought in 19,000 troops who are waiting in the suburbs in case violence breaks out at the event. And the FBI and the Department of Justice under Robert Kennedy are closely monitoring the march's leaders, including Dr. King. The march was 100% peaceful. And you can see right here a program for the march, which was given out to people who attended in person. We've got a lot of really great famous names here. The program begun with a rendition of the national anthem by Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson famously sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee" on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the Roosevelt presidency. And so here she is again performing the national anthem. A. Philip Randolph gives the opening remarks, and he was the organizer, the director of the march. We also have Mrs. Medgar Evers, and we'll talk a little bit about Medgar Evers. You can see that John Lewis spoke, recently passed away John Lewis, for whom the current voting rights legislation that the Democrats are pursuing is named. That bill is called the John Lewis Bill. We have Walter Reuther, hope I'm pronouncing that right, the president of the United Automobile, Aerospace, and Agricultural and Pertinent Workers of America. The UAW had put up a lot of money for the march. There are 2 rabbis who are here at the event as well. Rabbi Joachim Prinz will actually compare the civil rights struggle in America to the struggle of the Jews in Germany during the time of Hitler.
I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime. I learned many things. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence.
Miss Mahalia Jackson will be singing some songs. And finally, you can see at the end there, Dr. Martin Luther King gives his speech. He is representing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And there in the bottom, the theme song of the civil rights movement, "We Shall Overcome." The march was not an improvised event. There was a lot of planning and a lot of funding that went into it. Here we can see from the New York Times, the day before the march, a bunch of nuns and other volunteers working to prepare lunches for the marchers. 80,000 lunches they prepared. It's not going to be enough.
In New York, volunteers worked for 2 days and 2 nights to make lunches for the march. They made 80,000 cheese sandwiches.
We shall overcome.
So you can see that there's a lot of excitement behind this march, but not everyone in the Black community is excited about this event. This is a clip of some of the radio coverage of the March on Washington. Let's listen.
One of the other antagonistic groups expected to show up sometime today is a group called the Prospects. They're made up of affluent Negro and white right-wingers, and reportedly they're sending a caravan of cars here to demonstrate in the Washington area. Another possible source of demonstrators is the militant Negro sect of Black Muslims, although their leader, Malcolm X, has said that he wants nothing to do with the march today.
So there's a right-wing group with some black members who are not supporting the protest, but you can also see that there is a so-called black Muslim by the name of Malcolm X who is not in attendance. We're going to hear more about him later. So in order to understand why this march took place and why Dr. King gave the speech he gave, we need to look at the entire year of 1963. So let's take a moment and just review the timeline of events that we're going to be covering here in this video. We're going to start with the end of 1962, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has just completed a successful desegregation campaign in Albany, Georgia. So he's coming off the heels of some successes here. And the question is, what is Dr. King going to do now? The first thing Dr. King wants to see happen is on January 1st, 1963, he wants a second Emancipation Proclamation, which will declare segregation a new form of slavery and abolish it by federal decree. In March of 1963, Dr. King launches a major campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, and the events of Birmingham are going to weigh heavily on what happens in this story. From March through May 1963, violence tears through Alabama, and King pushes for a federal law banning segregation. In June of 1963, President John F. Kennedy gives an Oval Office address calling for civil rights legislation, and we're going to look at some clips of that video. In July of 1963, President Kennedy introduced a civil rights bill to the Congress, and that act is going to push Dr. King and others to focus their efforts on a grandiose march that will advertise and dramatize this new legislation. So a march which had already been planned for August of 1963, called the March of Jobs, combines with Dr. King's March for Civil Rights to create this event, and it takes place on August 28th, 1963. Dr. King delivers his speech at this event. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to take a look at each section of Dr. King's speech. We'll examine what he said, and we'll talk about the events that were going on around the country which inspired that specific rhetoric, those specific words which King uses in the speech.
50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free.
The opening of the speech is very similar to the opening of the Gettysburg Address. And of course, that is intentional. Dr. King is giving the speech with Abraham Lincoln sitting in marble right behind him. I placed both of the speeches side by side here. On the left is the intro to the I Have a Dream speech, and on the right is the intro to the Gettysburg Address. And I highlighted some of the parallels here that you can see. First of all, the obvious parallel, 50 years ago, 77 years ago. Lincoln is calling back to a moment in history, and so is Dr. King. In Lincoln's case, it is the moment when our fathers brought forth a new nation. In Dr. King's case, it is when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. We can also see that in Lincoln's address, the word liberty, equal appears. In Dr. King's, we have slaves, injustice, captivity as well at the very bottom there. And lastly, both speakers begin by telling you where you are and when you are. In Abraham Lincoln's case, we are met on a great battlefield of the war. That speech was given in a cemetery where the Gettysburg battle had taken place. And in Dr. King's case, it is the shadow of Abraham Lincoln. He is standing in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln. Once that preamble has been spoken, both speakers then turn to the issue. President Lincoln uses the word now. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, and the civil war is the issue at hand, testing whether free government can survive. In Dr. King's case, he uses the word but. But 100 years later, and what is the problem? The Negro still is not free. So the theme of the speech was very much rooted in the idea of a second emancipation. 1963 was the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. In that proclamation, Lincoln had declared 3.5 of the 4 million enslaved people of the United States free. Dr. King had urged President Kennedy to write a second Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, abolishing segregation and committing the federal government's full power to protecting the rights of African American people. January 1st came and went, and Kennedy did not issue the proclamation. So King changed tactics and urged the administration to put a bill before Congress. Once again, President Kennedy made a very half-hearted effort, and the bill quickly died in Congress. Here's what Robert Kennedy had to say about it.
There wasn't any interest in it. There was no public demand for it. There was no demand by the newspaper or radio or television. Nobody paid any attention.
Robert Kennedy, by the way, JFK's Attorney General, also happens to be his brother. By far the most pro-civil rights person in Kennedy's cabinet. He's also going to be spying on Martin Luther King at certain points. But you can see what are some of the key things that Attorney General Kennedy says went wrong with the bill. No public demand. No demand in the newspapers, radio, or television. No attention was paid for it. We're very much looking at this in terms of getting the newspapers to notice it, the radio, to blast this thing around the country, PR, got to get people's attention in order to pass a bill like this. And he will devote the rest of this year to making sure that he gets the country's attention. Now, the big question for Martin Luther King here is, can President Kennedy be a Lincoln? Will he emancipate Black Americans from the terrible segregation and discrimination that they're experiencing? Well, there are some key differences between Kennedy and Lincoln. Number one, Lincoln had issued the proclamation 2 years into an ongoing civil war. The crisis of war is what justified the proclamation. President Kennedy is not at war with the South, and so he does not have the commander-in-chief powers that Abraham Lincoln at least claimed he had when he issued the Emancipation. If Kennedy is too strong on this issue, he could end up splitting the country. He could create a backlash that is bigger than he can handle. And short of a civil war, he could at least provoke the more extreme elements of the South and cause attacks on innocent Black people if he is too heavy-handed. Which brings us to the fact that Lincoln had enforced his proclamation by bayonet. He had millions of soldiers in the South fighting the war. Kennedy has the National Guard. It's not quite the same. Here's another problem for JFK. Kennedy is planning to pursue an aggressive and moralistic, almost idealistic foreign policy. He's going to be preaching human rights around the world. And so with all of the unrest that's going to be taking place in the United States, it's going to be very easy for the Soviet Union, for example, to point to the United States and say, ha, you aren't as moral as you claim to be. J. Edgar Hoover is spying on him, of course. We're going to talk about how Kennedy spied on Martin Luther King a little bit later, but Kennedy himself is being spied on by his own FBI. And his closeness, his friendliness with Dr. King is going to create problems for him within the FBI. And some are even going to suggest that that's part of how JFK ended up getting assassinated. Both Lincoln and Kennedy encounter strong opposition from the South, but for Kennedy, this means opposition within his own party. The Democratic Party dominates the South, and there's a lot of opposition to Kennedy within his own party. To underscore that point, let's look at the 1960 election map here. You can see that it was an extremely close race. Geographically, Nixon picked up a much larger piece of the country, but in the more populated areas, people voted for JFK. Even in the South, the traditional hub of the Democratic Party, Kennedy wins a lot of votes, but we can see that Florida ended up going for Nixon. But look over here at Mississippi. It's kind of interesting. Mississippi, some of Alabama, and some of Oklahoma are actually not blue or red. And it says that they voted for somebody named Byrd. So this was actually Harry Byrd. He was a segregationist in the Democratic Party. So when you vote for president, you vote for electors who go to an electoral college, and then they cast their vote for the president. So you vote for the elector who votes for the candidate that you want to win. But in Mississippi, they put up electors who were not committed to any candidate. And so any Mississippian who voted for the Democratic ticket for president, they didn't actually know who they were voting for until Electoral College Day, when it was discovered that they ended up casting their votes for this guy, Harry Byrd, who was a pro-segregation guy. So the Democratic Party in the South, in certain states, is actually trying to sabotage JFK's chances at winning the election. So that should give you some indication of the general feeling towards JFK at this time. You can see in 1964, Alabama Democrats pulled these shenanigans. They actually managed to get Lyndon Johnson's name wiped off the November ballot. And it's because of some of these electoral shenanigans that many people start to argue that we need electoral reform. Sounds like something we're arguing today, right? I just want to take a look here. This is a letter that was passed around to Alabama voters from the Democratic Party of Alabama. And you can see at the top, there's a stamp that says, "White supremacy for the right." And as we look through this document, we can see that they're complaining that black voters are supporting John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson for president in 1960. And so they say, "Elect us and we will protect to the utmost our Southern way of life, a way of life acquired by the blood of our forefathers across a path which led over the bones of men and the tears of women, so that it might be preserved and passed on untainted to the future sons and daughters of this great state. We are the guardians, so to speak, of their inheritance. We must stand true to the trust." This is the kind of opposition that President Kennedy is going up against among the white segregationists of the South. So 1963 gets off to a real good start with George Wallace delivering his infamous inauguration speech as he takes the oath to become Alabama's governor.
"Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done, time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us, and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Now, if the white segregationists are against Kennedy, that doesn't automatically mean that the entire black community is supporting JFK. In fact, the black community had traditionally supported the Republican Party. Dr. Martin Luther King's father was a Republican. This fella right here, Jackie Robinson, the first black man to play in Major League Baseball, unsegregated, supported Richard Nixon for president in 1960 over John F. Kennedy. Then the 60s is a period of realignment for the two parties. And we're going to see a lot of black voters are going to shift after this election into the Democratic Party column, including Jackie Robinson, who will not support Richard Nixon for president in 1968. So let's get back to the speech.
But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
So Dr. King here talks about the manacles of segregation, the chains of discrimination. He says that Black lives take place on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. And he calls the Black man an exile in his own land. This is not just aspirational or philosophical in nature. There is a material element here. The United States is a rich country, and yet the Black community is not sharing in that wealth. The other thing I want to talk about in this section of the speech, 100 years later. 100 years later. The theme of 100 years later was really the theme of the whole entire year. And the civil rights marchers were not the only ones who were on the page of 100 years later.
100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
In order to understand the lead up to the I Have a Dream speech, you have to understand what was going on in Birmingham, Alabama that year. Dr. King had conducted a major campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, which he considered the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. There were no Black police officers, no firefighters, sales clerks, right? So you can only stock the shelves. You couldn't actually work in sales. Bus drivers, bank tellers, store cashiers. Jobs were very limited, and the unemployment rate in the Black community of Birmingham was 2.5 times higher than that for white people. There's racial segregation of public and commercial facilities, and it is strictly enforced, especially with the civil rights movement ramping up. Only 10% of Alabama's Black population is registered to vote in 1960. This is also a time when the economy is shifting from a blue-collar economy, a workers' economy, to a more white-collar economy. And so that will require degrees from universities, and the better, more prestigious the university, the more opportunity you'll have. And so many desegregationists will focus their efforts on whites-only colleges. And with the enfranchisement of Black people, with the assistance of Black people to get involved in the economy, there's a fear of competition among white workers. I would be remiss if I did not mention the ever-present reality of terrorism in Birmingham and around the South. In Birmingham in particular, there are 50 unsolved racially motivated bombings between 1945 and 1962, which had earned the city the nickname Bombingham. All of this violence and chaos is fueling the fires of Black nationalism and Black separatism. Among them is an organization led by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad called the Nation of Islam, and its most famous spokesman, Malcolm X.
Whites are against integration in practice, but they're for it in principle. So the only solution is separation. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says that this can be brought about simply by letting our people be exposed to the truth about ourselves, about the white man, about our history and our condition in this country. And once we are exposed to the complete truth about things as they actually exist in this country, the masses of Black people will choose complete separation from this entire system, political system, economic system, social system, and whatever other aspect or description or adjective you want to attach to it. Let us go back home to our own people, live among our own kind, and solve our own problems ourselves. And if the white man doesn't want us to go back to our own people and live in our own country, then since we can't get along together in peace on this country with white people, let us separate part of this continent, migrate to that separate territory, let the government give us everything we need to establish our own independent economic system and society, and thereby we'll be able to solve our own problems ourselves and prove that we are human beings and a part of the human family and can do for ourselves what other humans have done for themselves. And then we'll be able to stop blaming the white man for what he has done and stop begging the white man to solve our problems. We'll be able to solve our problems ourselves.
With Malcolm X, you're going to find a lot of this has to do with giving the Black man the opportunity to be an actor in the drama of history, not merely a side character in the story, right? And that's why he is moving towards separatism. This was a big issue with the Zionists who founded Israel. They felt that the Jews did not have the ability to have an active role in their own destiny. And Malcolm X believes that the black man does not have control of his own destiny in the American system. And so he will advocate for a separate homeland for black people. And this is going to get into one of the biggest rivalries in the civil rights movement between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Here's Martin Luther King giving a sermon in which he addresses black nationalism.
The black man made America wealthy. That's why I tell you right now, I'm not going anywhere. They can talk, these groups, some people talking about a separate state. Go back to Africa. I love Africa. It's our ancestral home. I don't know about you. My grandfather and my great-grandfather did too much to build this nation for me to be talking about getting away from it. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth in 1620, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They've made cotton king. With their hands and with their backs and with their labor. They built the sturdy docks, the stout factories, the impressive mansions of the South. Now this nation is telling us that we can't build. Negroes are excluded almost absolutely from the building trade. It's lily white. Why? Because these jobs pay $6, $7, $8, $9, and $10 an hour, and they don't want Negroes to have it.
So Dr. King saying our people were here before the Mayflower, right? 1619. We labored to build this country, and there's no reason why we should give it up. We should just have a bigger share in the destiny of the country. We should be citizens. We should be a part of this country, not treated as second class. Desegregating the unions and the building trades so that black men and women can work and get decent wages. And that's a fight that isn't exclusive to black Americans, right? The struggle over the working day, the struggle to get decent wages and be treated with respect is something that they can share with white people. We're going to see a lot of fighting within the unions, but we're going to see a lot of progress over the year 1963 in terms of opening things up for black people to be a part of the workforce. JFK in June of 1963 is going to prohibit job discrimination at all federal projects. Patterson unions open membership. So unions are starting to open up membership July 26th. Unions in the building and construction trades here voted unanimously to open their journeyman and apprentice programs to all qualified applicants. Negro is promoted by Goldwater store. The first Negro sales clerk employed by Goldwater's department store said today that customers and other workers couldn't be nicer. And so this person, and that might not seem like much today, but they would literally, if you came into work and you were black, they would just make you stock shelves. And so they're saying, you know what? We're not afraid to have a black person represent us at the cash register. It's small, but it's a lot. Plumbers seeking union members, not just opening the roles, not just desegregating, but actively seeking black employees and Puerto Ricans as well, according to this article here. So Dr. King's message is not just ideological, it is rooted in something material. And what we're going to hear in the next section of the I Have a Dream speech is some of that material foundation.
And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds.
So taking a look at the text here, King says that the marchers have come to Washington, D.C. to cash a check, a promissory note. Says that America has defaulted on its promissory note and that the Negro people have been given a bad check, basically saying the check bounced. The Declaration of Independence bounced. And this phrase, promissory note, is really important to understanding the speech. There's a little bit of controversy about whose idea this actually was. Clarence B. Jones, who was an advisor to Dr. King and a lawyer, in an interview with the Washington Post in 2011, he claimed that promissory note came from a conversation that he'd had with Governor Nelson Rockefeller during the Alabama campaign. He says that when Dr. King began his speech and talked about the promissory note, that he was essentially reciting the opening suggestions that Jones had handed in the night before. Now, I'm not calling the respected Dr. Jones a liar, but in my experience of learning about history, sometimes people exaggerate how much influence they had over certain events, especially if it's a famous speech. Just look at how many people claimed that they saw Abraham Lincoln writing the Gettysburg Address, or they suggested something that Abraham Lincoln was like, oh, that's a good idea, and he wrote it down. You know, we'll forgive him for it. But I did find an article from July 1st where Roy Wilkins, who was the executive director of the NAACP, and he talked about the colored people of the country coming to collect on a promise given by Abraham Lincoln. He says, our NAACP convention has come back to Chicago in 1963. Illinois is Lincoln's home state. The due date of freedom, he says. We were promised it by the man who sleeps in Illinois soil at Springfield, and we are here to collect. 100 years we have extended this promissory note at the cost of humiliation, exploitation, persecution, and death. So another thing I want to examine in this section of the speech is the allusions to the founding documents. And I want to talk a little bit about what Martin Luther King's attitude was toward the founding of the country. And you can see here that Dr. King refers to the architects of the Republic. He talks about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and he calls it a promise for unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he says that honoring this is a sacred obligation. So clearly he is very pro-United States and pro-Constitution and Declaration of Independence. It's just that for Dr. King, the United States needs to actually honor its sacred obligation. It has to live up to its founding documents. And that's very similar to something that Abraham Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address. The unfinished work which the Union soldiers were engaged in. He talked about a great task that remains before us, something yet unfulfilled, which Lincoln will refer to as a new birth of freedom. So he's going to very much be seeing what's going on in the country during his presidency as the United States having a new birth of freedom, rejuvenating the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Let's listen to what Dr. King says about the founding documents.
By the 1,000 students and adults decided to sit in at segregated lunch counters to protest conditions there. And when they were sitting at those lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and seeking to take the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
And here's JFK.
This nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal, and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened.
I'm sure by now you have guessed that Malcolm X has a much different view of the founding documents.
You say then that the United States is not the black man's country.
Definitely
American
not.
laws
No,
are
no.
not black man's laws.
No. So,
American laws are not the black man's laws.
well, the laws here in America were made by white people for the benefit of white people. The Constitution was written by whites for the benefit of whites. It was never written for the benefit of blacks. And when you read the Constitution, I think in Article 1, Section 2, or Section 1, Article 1, some one of the two, and it's in the Constitution. It says that it classifies black people as 3/5 of a man. 3/5 of a man, subhuman, less than a human being. It relegates us to the level of cattle, hogs, chickens, cows, a commodity that could be bought and sold at the will of the master. No, it was written by whites for the benefit of whites and to the detriment of blacks. And when a black man stands up talking about his constitutional rights, he's out of his mind.
So for Malcolm X, there is no living up to the promise of the Constitution because there is no promise in the Constitution for the black man. It classifies him as 3/5 of a person. Black people were enslaved not just in the South when the Constitution was adopted, but almost in the entire country. For Malcolm X, there is no new birth of freedom on the horizon. All right, let's continue with the next section of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech now.
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
So you can see here that Dr. King is employing repetition, very much rooted in the gospel tradition, the black churches, right? To repeat a phrase, it kind of makes the audience get emotional and start to burst out, oh yes, they'll start saying as Dr. King repeats, now is the time, now is the time. This is the second time Dr. King has done this. The first time, 100 years later. 100 years later, now is the time, now is the time, now is the time. This contrasts very much with the idea of the luxury of cooling off, the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. What is Dr. King talking about here? The tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Well, to understand that, we have to go back to the Birmingham letters. When Martin Luther King was in jail in Birmingham in 1963, during the campaign, he wrote a series of letters in which he expressed basically everything that was on his mind at the time. And these letters were published as a pamphlet known as the Letters from a Birmingham Jail. It's a very famous document in the history of nonviolent resistance. In one of those letters, Dr. King complains about the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. He says, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. This letter is not far off from some of the things that Malcolm X had been saying as well.
I think there are many whites who act friendly toward Negroes. A fox acts friendly toward the lamb. And usually the fox is the one who ends up with the lamb chop on his plate. The wolf doesn't act friendly, and therefore the wolf has more difficulty in getting the lamb chop in his plate.
I'd like to point out, though, that...
And I say that because it is usually if you study the structure of the Negro community, economically, politically, civically, psychologically, and otherwise, it's controlled by the white liberal, who usually poses as the friend of the Negro, who actually differs from the white conservative in the same way that the fox differs from the wolf. Their appetite is the same. Their motives are the same. It's only their mannerisms and methods that differ.
So the big difference between Malcolm X and King here is that King is very much appealing to whites to stop acting this way, whereas Malcolm X is saying that this is how white people act, or at least this is how white American liberals act. I don't think that he's saying all white people, just by having this color skin, act this way. I think he's saying that in America, the system is set up and the history of the country is such that white people in this country are always going to act this way. There is no hope and there's no reason to write a letter to try to appeal to them to change their stripes. They will always be the wolf, and the wolf will always get the lamb chop on his plate. Dr. King will fundamentally reject that principle, and he will devote his time to trying to not only push white liberals and moderates to support him, but also to push the mechanisms of power to intervene for the Black community. So in 1963, Dr. King decides that after many desegregation campaigns, which had taken place on the local and state level, it was time to push the federal government toward a federal law. And in pursuit of this goal, he worked very closely with President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was initially very cold to the cause of desegregation. We talked a little bit about problems in the Democratic Party, his unpopularity in the South, the fact that he's also an Irish Catholic, and there's still a lot of discrimination against Irish Catholics as well. Dr. Martin Luther King will try to convince Kennedy essentially that he could be another Lincoln. And any president, especially JFK, I'd have to say, is going to be tempted by the possibility of being the next Lincoln. One of the problems with being so close to power and so close to President Kennedy is that Kennedy's going to try to dissuade Martin Luther King from engaging in massive direct action campaigns. As soon as Kennedy says, "We support you, we'll put a bill on the floor," he's going to follow it up with, "Oh, and can you pull back on some of those demonstrations that are making me look very bad?" It means that President Kennedy is going to have some influence on the movement. But at the same time, it also means that Martin Luther King can threaten direct action campaigns directly to President Kennedy's face. And so these direct action campaigns can put pressure on the federal government to take action. Once again, by working with power, Martin Luther King is going to open himself up to surveillance. John F. Kennedy is also going to open himself up to surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover thinks that the civil rights movement is American Bolshevism. He thinks that it is funded and supported by the Soviet Union. It's a mechanism to make us look bad, to help the Soviets win the Cold War. He thinks basically Martin Luther King is like a communist traitor. He's going to be wiretapping and spying on Dr. King and then bringing what he's found to President Kennedy and basically threatening President Kennedy to cut this guy off. Kennedy's going to feel the pressure from the FBI, and then he's going to make appeals to Martin Luther King to take certain actions that'll make his life easier. For example, one time J. Edgar Hoover comes to JFK and says, "Dr. King is very close with this gentleman who has clearly participated in pro-communist rallies, who has written pro-communist literature." A couple days later, when Martin Luther King comes to meet with John F. Kennedy and discuss strategies, Kennedy takes him aside and says, "You need to fire this one guy because he's making you look bad and he's making me look bad." And King actually fires the guy. His name was Jack Odell. Here is what Dr. King wrote to Jack Odell in a letter.
The situation in our country is such that any allusion to the left brings forth an emotional response which would seem to indicate the SCLC and the Southern Freedom Movement are communist-inspired. In these critical times, we cannot afford to risk any such impressions. We therefore have decided in our administrative committee that we should request to make your resignation permanent.
So Martin Luther King's going to make some sketchy decisions as he tries to toe this line between the active movement in the streets and the contradictions of power. King and Kennedy have a lot of shared dilemmas. They're both very unpopular with whites in the South. They're both being surveilled by J. Edgar Hoover. Violence at home could spoil America's freedom fighter image abroad, and that's a problem for JFK. Both of them are struggling to prevent violence, but only one of the two is committed to preventing all disturbances, and that's JFK. Martin Luther King needs to rock the boat in order to get the changes he seeks. JFK, if he could have it his way, none of this would be happening and everything would just be fine. King will insist to JFK that if his peaceful methods fail, riots, separatism, militarism is going to follow. And for Dr. King and his community, the threat is existential. King believes that if violence breaks out, the black people of the South will be wiped out.
If our white brothers dismiss as rabble-rousers and outside agitators those of us who employ nonviolent direct action, and if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies, a development that would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare.
The Alabama campaign converges onto a high-profile standoff between two black students seeking to attend the all-white University of Alabama and the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who will refuse to allow the black students into the university. On May 21st, 1963, federal courts ordered the University of Alabama to admit 2 African-American students for the summer session. On June 11th, 1963, Governor George Wallace blocked the entrance to prevent the students from entering. President Kennedy mobilized the Alabama National Guard to escort the student into the university.
The Guard of State Police, as Governor George Wallace prepares to confront a deputy U.S. attorney. The federal officers are armed with a proclamation from President Kennedy. The governor is adamant. He made a campaign promise to stand in the doorway himself to prevent the integration of the last all-white state university. President Kennedy federalizes the Alabama National Guard, and they move to the campus. Brigadier General Henry Graham arrives to tell the governor, "It's my sad duty to ask you to step aside on orders of the President of the United States." The governor yields to federal authority. 5 minutes after the governor leaves, James Hood is the first of his race to become a University of Alabama student. He is followed into the registrar's office by Vivian Malone. Both the students are 20 years old and will take summer courses.
Meredith incident and the enrollment of him in the university.
Well, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad wants justice for every one of the 20 million so-called Negroes, and to just take one Negro and stick him in college with the aid of 15,000 troops and at a cost of $6,000 is a disgrace. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. It's a farce. It's hypocrisy. Because if it's right for one Negro to be forced into that university, then every Negro in the state of Mississippi who is qualified has the same right to go to that university. And if the government is not ready and willing to enforce the right of every Negro in the state of Mississippi, then in my opinion, sir, it's only hypocrisy to pretend that they are for justice by pushing one Negro in and blowing it up all over the world to make it look like they're solving the problem when millions of black people in that state are still going to segregated schools and getting an inferior education.
The desegregation of the University of Alabama, or at least the fact that 2 black students were allowed in, is what inspires President Kennedy to get on camera from the Oval Office and make an impassioned appeal to the American people to change their hearts and minds about civil rights, to support him and the administration and the civil rights movement toward an equitable solution. And so on June 11th, 1963, John F. Kennedy gives the speech which we've been watching clips of this entire time, his civil rights address.
It ought to be possible, therefore, for American students of any color to attend any public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation, such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution.
This speech will be the signal that Martin Luther King is waiting for, that the administration will be behind civil rights reform. It is also a signal to the white supremacist terrorists of the South. And these people are definitely white supremacist terrorists. These are the definition. They are literally Ku Klux Klan. So it is a signal to white supremacists that they too need to take action against the civil rights movement. And that night, the field secretary for the NAACP in Jackson, Mississippi, Medgar Evers, is killed by a sniper's bullet. So right after that speech, they went out and found Medgar Evers and killed him. 2 days later, a group of African nationalists called the United African Nationalist Movement called for Southern blacks to arm themselves in self-defense. James Lawson said in a statement, "I am very shocked and sad about his death. However, it points up the futility of Dr. Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolence." So there is a lot of pressure building on Martin Luther King. People are actually getting angry at Martin Luther King. They're saying that this peaceful, nonviolent thing is a farce. We need to arm ourselves in self-defense. We cannot leave our people vulnerable to the attacks of white terrorists. And Dr. King is going to have to take these criticisms very seriously because real people's lives are in the balance here. So let's jump back in now to the I Have a Dream speech and see if Dr. King has more to say on this subject.
It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges.
I like to refer to this section of the speech as the Jeremiad, and that comes from the word Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a biblical prophet from the Old Testament. He wrote the book of Lamentations, and he was known as the weeping prophet. Jeremiah basically sat up on a rock and looked down at society and was like, here's everything you're doing wrong. And if you don't fix it now, it is going to be fatal for the society. God is going to punish his place. He's going to take his blessings away. And so this section of the speech is very much in that tradition of the Jeremiad. It was a form of expression that became very popular during the abolitionist movement in the United States. Frederick Douglass was also a big fan of the Jeremiad. It's not just a biblical tradition, it's also a very American tradition. King says it will be fatal for the nation to overlook this moment. He talks about the sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent, which is a quote from Shakespeare, "Now is the winter of our discontent." I forget which play that is. You can write it down in the comments below. That would be appreciated. He says that the country is going to have a rude awakening. and that there will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until Black Americans have all the rights they are due. And he talks about the whirlwinds of revolt and how he will shape the foundations of the nation. He's going to bring this temple down, as Jesus would say. And a great example of the kind of foundation-shaking action that Martin Luther King is taking during this time will be the Children's March. The Children's March took place during the Birmingham campaign of 1963. King is not only trying to achieve his goals as a civil rights activist, he's also trying to convince his own community and his supporters that nonviolent direct action works. The idea is pretty simple. You go somewhere, you make a big scene, you disrupt the economy, you get a whole bunch of your supporters arrested and thrown in jail to the point where the jails overflow with prisoners. All of this gets broadcast on the television, which engenders support and sympathy among your average TV watching American who's not in the streets fighting for civil rights. At the time, over 50 million people owned a TV. So a lot of people are watching all this happen. Wouldn't be the case 20 years ago, 30 years ago. These demonstrations often take the form of marching in the streets, sit-ins at whites-only lunch counters. So after a few weeks of King implementing direct action tactics in Birmingham, so many of his supporters were in jail that he had basically run out of people to send out in the streets. So King finally made a desperate call for the children of Birmingham to cut school, go out in the streets, and protest. It's going to be very controversial. And King will agonize over this decision because he knows that when you're out there marching, you are going to be exposed to the hoses, the dogs, and all of the violence that the marchers experience. These kids could very well die. You could see here, New York Times coverage of the Children's Crusade, 1,000 people thrown in jail.
This is the first time in the history of our struggle that we have been able literally to fill the jails. In a real sense, this is the fulfillment of a dream, for I have always felt that if we could fill the jails in our witness for freedom, it would be a magnificent expression of the determination of the Negro and a marvelous way to lay the whole issue before the conscience of the local and national community. And I think in a real sense, this Birmingham movement is one of the most inspiring developments in the whole nonviolent struggle.
So one of the big effects of the Children's March is that it brought a lot of attention to the situation, and thus more people came and joined the fight. And on May 5th, the largest demonstration took place so far. On that day, there were 3,000 young people marching. As they marched down the street, the police set up a barricade, which included hoses and dogs, but the marchers kept moving toward the barricades and they refused to turn around. It's kind of like the story of the Edmund Pettus Bridge and how John Lewis refused to turn around and ended up getting beaten by the cops. He was actually permanently disfigured by what happened to him at the hands of police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So this is, when these people are marching toward this barricade, you know, they know this could go any way. As the march leaders approached the police barricades, they refused to turn. Police chief, who was an exceptionally racist dude named Bull Connor, ordered the police to turn on the hoses. But the police and firemen actually refused and backed off. Some of them were even crying as this was happening. The next day, 3,000 people were arrested in Birmingham, the most in the entire duration of the struggle. With the situation becoming absolutely untenable, community leaders, business leaders, politicians decided to come to the table and negotiate with Dr. King and his movement. During this time, Robert Kennedy, from his office at the Department of Justice, is making hundreds of calls to Birmingham officials, trying to twist their arms to sit down and negotiate with the NAACP and Dr. King. Here's some more dramatic images published in the New York Times. This is what people were seeing when they picked up their copy of the New York Times that day. The first thing they saw on the front page was a black man being attacked by a police dog.
We must say to our white brothers all over the South who tried to keep us down, we will match your capacity to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with soul force. we will not hate you. And yet we cannot in all good conscience obey your evil laws. Do to us what you will, threaten our children, and we will still love you. Say that we're too low, that we're too degraded, yet we will still love you. Bomb our homes and go by our churches early in the morning and bomb them if you please, and we will still love you. In winning the victory, we will not only win our freedom, we will so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we will win you in the process.
So this might be a good time to talk a little bit about non-violent direct action. First of all, Martin Luther King gets his ideas from Jesus, of course, a big influence. He is a Christian minister after all. Jesus Christ, who was crucified on a cross while he was dying and writhing in pain, he famously said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." The Bible says that a Roman centurion heard Jesus say these words and was very deeply impressed by it. He said, "Surely this is a righteous man." And so the lesson there is that the man who suffers for a good cause, whether it's the sins of mankind or desegregation, is the righteous man. And that he sets the example for all others. And that those who want to also be righteous can take up their cross and follow him. And so Martin Luther King and all the people who follow him are taking up their crosses, following in the footsteps of Jesus here. Martin Luther King is also going to be heavily influenced by a concept from the Jain religion. That's a religion in India. The concept of ahimsa, which is basically nonviolence, do no harm. The Jains are very careful about doing harm to the earth or even stepping on bugs, they say. I don't know if that's true. That might be an exaggerated claim, but they're supposedly very careful about how they tread so as not to cause harm to the world. And that principle is what inspires Mahatma Gandhi to embrace nonviolence as a tactic to use in his struggle for home rule for India. And so he will gather his supporters. They will go on long marches. They'll get the international newspapers and reporters to cover what they're doing. The British troops will shoot them, kill them, sometimes by the hundreds. And eventually, Mahatma Gandhi wears the British people down. It's not just about getting international attention, by the way. It's also about changing the hearts and minds of the people who are doing the violence to you. The Roman centurion hears Jesus say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And that example of sacrifice changes the Roman centurion's heart. And according to some traditions, that centurion ended up becoming a Christian. So he took up his cross too. Malcolm X, on the other hand, will say, why are you trying to change hearts and minds? It's not going to happen. There was a tradition of nonviolence in the United States as well. It wasn't just in India. There were anti-war protesters, an anti-war movement that grew, especially during World War I in the 1910s. One of those leaders, Bayard Rustin, became a friend of Mahatma Gandhi, traveled to India many times, and he was the one who taught Martin Luther King about nonviolence. King himself traveled to India, and when he returned, he was convinced that nonviolence was the most potent weapon against segregation and the other ills that plague the Black community. But none of this nonviolence stuff is really going to mean anything unless Dr. King is able to accomplish something, unless he's able to extract some kind of material concessions from the ruling order. In the case of Birmingham, on May 10th, he does actually manage to reach an agreement with the power structure. For 3 days, Martin Luther King, the NAACP, and the business leaders and politicians of Birmingham discussed an agreement to end the protests. King suspended demonstrations during this time period, so they got to see what it was like to have a little peace and quiet. All of Dr. King's demands were met. Lunch counters desegregated, restrooms desegregated, fountains desegregated. Within 60 days, Black people would be hired as clerks, sales representatives. They would get other positions that were exclusively white. A biracial committee would be created to establish communication between the Black and white community, and scores of prisoners would be released on bond. The majority of the money that was put up to bail out these prisoners, of whom there were thousands, came from the United Auto Workers Union. Unions, solidarity, not in every case, but the UAW was certainly a strong ally to the civil rights movement. However, some saw the Birmingham Agreement as worth little more than the paper it was written on. In fact, some protesters compared the Birmingham Agreement to the various treaties that white settlers conducted with indigenous people. And of course, Malcolm X was among those who shared in the cynicism.
So that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man. And they have proved it throughout the country by the police dogs and the police clubs. 100 years ago, they used to put on a white sheet and use a bloodhound against Negroes. Today, they have taken off the white sheet and put on police uniforms. They've traded in the bloodhounds for police dogs, and they're still doing the same thing. And just as Uncle Tom, back during slavery, used to keep the Negroes from resisting the bloodhound or resisting the Ku Klux Klan by teaching them to love their enemy or pray for those who use them despitefully. Today, Martin Luther King is just a 20th century or modern Uncle Tom or a religious Uncle Tom who is doing the same thing today to keep Negroes defenseless in the face of attack that Uncle Tom did on the plantation to keep those Negroes defenseless in the face of the attack.
So Malcolm X calling Martin Luther King a modern day or religious Uncle Tom, somebody who is parading himself around as a leader for the black community, but who ultimately has been co-opted by the white liberal establishment and is merely a puppet for the same old discriminatory policies that black people have always experienced in the country. Let's go back now to the I Have a Dream speech and take a look at how Martin Luther King addressed the issue of white and black collaboration, the issue of working with white people in the struggle for civil rights.
But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone.
So there's obviously a lot I could say about these two paragraphs right here. Firstly, it's noticeable that King starts with the word but, and he says, there is something I must say to my people. There's a sense that King knows that this is going to be a less popular section of his speech. He says, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds, bitterness, and hatred. We cannot degenerate into physical violence, which he contrasts with the high plane of dignity and discipline. Discipline's an important word. The civil rights marchers were actually trained in nonviolence. They didn't just go walk into a restaurant and sit at a whites-only counter and get beaten up. They were prepared. They were trained in advance. And so they had to exercise discipline. They had to sit there as they were being called the N-word and being screamed at. And as police threatened to arrest them, cops would take their nightsticks and just hit these people. Sometimes, bang, hit them right over the head. You had to fall down and not say a word, and then get back up, and that was discipline. As opposed to physical violence, which is something that people degenerate into. Once again, we see King use the term soul force right there at the end of the paragraph. And he describes nonviolent direct action as a new militancy. So he's saying that we are being confrontational. We are militant. We are just doing it through nonviolent direct action. But it must not lead to a distrust of all white people. There was something like 60,000 white people at the March for Washington, and many thousands of white activists who joined hands and marched with the black activists together. For Dr. King, the allyship of white comrades is extremely important to the movement. King goes so far as to say that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. Again, returning to this idea that a threat to freedom in one community is a threat to freedom in all communities, and that the destiny of the black man is tied up with the destiny of the country. You cannot just treat it as something separate. If you do not meet the needs of the black community in the United States, the country will crumble, will destroy itself. And we've already heard what Malcolm X thinks about that, right? So let's continue.
And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
When will we be satisfied? And in this section of the speech, King lists the grievances of the black community. He talks about the horrors of police brutality. He talks about the fact that weary travelers cannot find lodging along the highways. Let's say you're a black businessman who lives in New York City and you have a business meeting in Dallas, Texas, and you've got to drive through the South. You could go for hundreds of miles without passing a single motel that wasn't whites only. So people are actually getting into car accidents because they'd fall asleep at the wheel because there's nowhere to stop along the way. Or they'd pull off to the side of the road and sleep in their car and they'd get carjacked and robbed. King is asking for basic mobility. He's also asking for an end to for whites only signs around the communities of the South. He says that segregation robs black children of their selfhood and their dignity. Finally, he says we will never be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes that he has nothing for which to vote. It's not all about the South here, right? King wants to see a new birth of freedom in the whole country. King's movement is not just about voting rights and political rights and laws. It's also about jobs, employment. It's about improving the economic conditions of Black America. So what exactly were the material demands of the movement? What did they want? I see this as when do we want? I should say what do we want? What do we want? We want federal laws guaranteeing voting rights for African Americans. Voter suppression, literacy tests, 10% of the black population in Alabama is eligible to vote. Also, don't forget about the shenanigans of the Mississippi and Alabama Democratic Party, who put up unpledged electors that didn't vote for President Kennedy. So King is also trying to stop some of these shenanigans as well. He's going to use federal power to do it. This is happening now, the debate. How much power should the federal government have over elections? The Constitution gives the states the right to conduct the elections, but do the states' laws have to conform to federal standards? And how much can the federal government do to force states to conduct their elections a certain way? Dr. King is going to 100% fall on the side of full federal power.
The key to everything is federal commitment, full, unequivocal, and unremitting.
the right to enroll in any university, the hiring of black employees in a range of industries, and a federal law banning segregation around the country. A few weeks after JFK delivers his June 11th civil rights speech to the nation, he is going to put a civil rights bill up for debate in the Congress. And he's collaborating with Martin Luther King on this bill. So King is having an influence on what's in the bill. And with Kennedy sinking his presidential political capital into pushing for civil rights legislation is what inspires Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders to organize a march on Washington to promote this effort.
The president himself must do more than issue a call, make certain recommendations.
What would you recommend he do, Dr. King? Should he give fireside chat on it?
I think so. I think he should give fireside chats on it, and I think more than one would be necessary. I think the president should also have conferences with congressmen and get them, try to persuade them to see the necessity of passing this bill. And I think he will need to talk with certain groups across the country so that it will create a climate of civil rights concern will be created, and people all over the country will be writing their senators and their representatives in Congress on this issue. I think these things are absolutely necessary, and I think the devotees of civil rights will have to do something. I mean, I think the civil rights leaders and all of the Negroes in the country, as well as their allies in the white community, will have to do something. And I don't throw out the idea of the necessity of a march on Washington, even sit-ins in Congress, to get this issue dramatized so much that it cannot be ignored.
And once again, we hear that word, dramatize. We have come to Washington to dramatize this issue. King's whole entire strategy is to dramatize the civil rights movement in order to effect material changes. After JFK gives his civil rights speech, and after the civil rights bill is put to the floor, the momentum towards the August march really starts to build. Some civil rights leaders began proposing the revival of an old idea from the 1940s. A. Philip Randolph had actually proposed a similar march in 1941 to protest racial discrimination in the war industries. However, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order which prohibited discrimination in national defense industries, so the march was canceled. In 1963, Randolph was already planning a march for jobs in August. King wanted to host a march for freedom, so they combined their efforts and created the March for Jobs and Freedom. And that was the official title of the march. On June 22nd, 1963, King meets with JFK, and JFK urges the event be postponed or even canceled. Kennedy says that such an event would actually hurt the chances of the bill. He feels that you've done the Birmingham campaign, you have already dramatized the condition of Black America for the whole country to see. Now it's time for the politicians to step in and do what they do. Discuss, debate, push, cajole, arm twist, and get this passed. And he's afraid that a march on Washington will actually hurt the chances of the bill. King responded to JFK with a very simple phrase. He said, "It's a matter of both, not either or." It's not a matter of politics are here and street activism is over here. He says we need a combination of both in order to push this over the finish line. For a few weeks leading up to the march in June and July, Dr. King went on a nationwide speaking tour. And on that speaking tour, he talked about all of these issues that would make their way into his I Have a Dream speech, including the idea of the dream itself. And so in many of his statements and in his speeches, you start to hear King talk about a dream, this word to dream. And many people in the movement really took to this idea of a dream, including one of the performers at the March on Washington, Mahalia Jackson. This is Mahalia Jackson performing at the March on Washington.
How we feel that Tell me how we got over. We had a mighty hard time. Carry on over. You know my soul. Look back and wonder. How did I make it over?
So Mahalia Jackson was performing maybe about 10 minutes before Dr. King was about to speak. And as he made his way to the podium, Mahalia Jackson said to him, she took him aside and she said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." Why did she say that? Well, this is actually a copy of an older speech which Martin Luther King gave. And in that speech, Dr. King said the following: "We are simply seeking to bring into full realization the American dream, a dream yet unfulfilled, living up to the promise of the Declaration, a dream of equality of opportunity, of privilege and property widely distributed, a dream of a land where men no longer argue that the color of a man's skin determines the content of his character, the dream of a land where every man will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. This is the dream. When it is realized, the jangling discords of our nation will be transformed into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood, and men everywhere will know that America is truly the land of the free and the home of the brave." This paragraph is more or less what appeared in the written text of Martin Luther King's speech, the day he gave the speech. The "I Have a Dream" section was not there. This is what was written there. But as King ascended the podium, Mahalia Jackson appealed to Dr. King's inner sermonizer. He was a preacher, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And she said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And so he put his notes aside. And this is what Martin Luther King said instead of this.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
So let's just briefly talk about what happened in the aftermath of this speech. Obviously, it was a huge hit. It was a huge success. King and the other leaders were invited to the White House after he made the speech, and JFK walked up to Martin Luther King and shook his hand and said, "I have a dream," which is hilarious. Dr. King became the most famous black leader in the entire country, and he was named Times Man of the Year in January of 1964. At the end of that year, Martin Luther King received the Nobel Peace Prize as well. James Baldwin, the great author and civil rights activist, was at the march. You could see him with Harry Belafonte there behind him. He's holding hands with Marlon Brando, who was also a big indigenous rights activist. And yeah, there's Charlton Heston as well.
Let my people go.
There were a lot of celebrities that came to the March on Washington, and the celebrities ranged from musicians to actors. Of course, they brought a lot of attention to the cause as well. This is a quote from James Baldwin about the march. He says, "That day, for a moment, it almost seemed that we stood on a height and could see our inheritance. Perhaps we could make the kingdom real. Perhaps the beloved community would not forever remain that dream one dreamed in agony." Malcolm X famously called it the farce on Washington. And as you heard earlier in this presentation, he was not in attendance. A few weeks after the march, major retaliation from white terrorists. A bomb was placed in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. It exploded, killing 4 little girls. So all the ecstasy and all the happiness of the moment were interrupted by the vicious murder of 4 girls. In the aftermath of that explosion, James Baldwin, who believed that the dream was possible only 2 weeks ago, had this to say.
"I know that this peculiar country has admired the doctrine of nonviolence for 6 or 8 or 9 years and has applauded all those children and all those ministers and all those men and women who went to jail, who got beaten with chains and with hoses, and who were attacked by dogs, has admired them and has done nothing whatever to help them. And furthermore, not only that, intends to keep on admiring them and sending them to jail and doing nothing whatever to help them. I don't want to see any more blood. Nobody's blood. My God. If we could end the nightmare tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I could die, in peace. But in fact, the nightmare will not be ended tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And the nation which has admired these boys and girls and men and women overlooks the fact that a boy who was, let us say, 17 in 1955 has now spent 8 years in the streets, is probably under a doctor's care for being beaten half to death by the power structure, ladies and gentlemen, not simply by some idle policeman. Policemen know who they're working for.
Moving on to the FBI. In the aftermath of King's speech, a report was circled around the FBI and eventually made its way to the president's desk, in which Martin Luther King was declared the most dangerous Negro leader of the future in this nation, from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. J. Edgar Hoover was actually in the Oval Office with Kennedy the very next day. He brought tapes that he'd recorded of Martin Luther King in his hotel rooms, and Martin Luther King was a bit of a philanderer, to put it lightly. J. Edgar Hoover brought these tapes to JFK and basically said, "You cannot be friends with this guy anymore. You've got to do something about it. Give me permission to wiretap, to bug, and surveil this guy." JFK does not want to give J. Edgar Hoover such permission, but feeling the pressure, he relents. And on November 8th, 1963, he gives J. Edgar Hoover permission to bug and wiretap all of Dr. King's phones, any motel that Dr. King stays in, and all of his homes and safe houses and other places that he stayed on his trips as he traveled around the country. JFK put a 30-day limit on the authorization to surveil Dr. King. That was on November 8th. Unfortunately, on November 22nd, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. By the time those 30 days went up, JFK was no longer president. And in fact, Martin Luther King continued to be surveilled all the way into the summer of 1966. On the day that JFK was assassinated, Martin Luther King turned to his wife and fellow activist, Coretta Scott King, and said that he believed he would not live to see the age of 40. Dr. King was 34 years old in 1963 when he gave the I Have a Dream speech, and he was dead by 1968. He did not live to see 40 years old. In the aftermath of Kennedy's death, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, pledged his administration to see through many of the reforms that JFK had promised during his. And indeed, on July 2nd, 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed and signed by President Johnson. You can see Martin Luther King standing right behind President Johnson as he signs the Civil Rights Act. The full name of the bill was an act to enforce the constitutional right to vote, to confer jurisdiction upon the district courts of the United States of America, to provide injunctive relief against discrimination in public accommodations, to authorize the Attorney General to institute suits to protect constitutional rights in public facilities and public education, to extend the Commission on Civil Rights, to prevent discrimination in federally assisted programs, to establish a Commission on Equal Employment. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gives the federal government more powers to enforce voting rights. It demands the desegregation of public accommodations, facilities, and educations. So remember, Dr. King is going into communities, into different states, and pushing for desegregation within those local and state communities. Now the federal government is demanding an end to segregation across the entire country. A Civil Rights Commission is established. It pushes for non-discrimination in employment so that Black folks can get hired at good jobs. It led to some other reforms, including the Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972 and the American Disabilities Act of 1990, as well as, in modern day, an expansion of LGBTQ rights, and that happened through the Supreme Court. So a lot of times how activist groups go about it now is they don't necessarily push for a federal law, but they'll bring a suit to the Supreme Court and claim that such and such a thing violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law and the Civil Rights campaign that preceded it are really foundational to understanding the history of civil rights, of humanitarianism, of desegregation, of equal opportunity and employment, non-discrimination in our legal code. So that about wraps it up for today. I hope that you had an opportunity to learn a lot of things that you didn't know about. I often find that people like to quote this speech. They like to quote Martin Luther King Jr., but not a lot of people actually know the history of what was going on at the time. So I hope this video helped to put this speech into context for you and also to expand and broaden your understanding of the civil rights movement, both in terms of its supporters, its successes and triumphs, and in terms of its critics, its failures.